Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is called Why Punk Never Really Destroyed Prog. Right? So this idea in sort of standard music history and criticism is the big narrative that goes with progressive rock. And it goes something like this: that all the music in the 60s was absolutely wonderful. The Beatles were wonderful, and early Pink Floyd was wonderful. And back then musicians were like creative and they were free. But as the 70s progressed, they got a little bit too big for their boots and they started to become pretentious and overblown. And you had bands like Yes and Genesis, which sort of took rock down a sort of blind alley of progressive rock, where they sort of lost their way. They lost their rock roots. They didn't understand what rock was really about. Of course, all the cool bands like the Ramones and Iggy Pop, they understood what rock was about, but the proggers didn't. It was a bunch of like middle-class, privileged people from art college making stuff which the person on the street didn't understand, and rock needed to be brought back down to its roots, and it was done that by bands like the Damned and the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and they came along, and then all the kids went, I can identify with that, and and there's Johnny Rotten with his I Hate Pink Floyd t-shirt on, and then suddenly all the prog bands look around and goes, oh my god, we're not relevant anymore, what shall we do? And they all die, and ELP makes Love Beach, and they look like some medallion wearing millionaires, in a sort of slightly homoerotic setting, and it all goes wrong, and they don't know what they're doing anymore, and prog dies, and then cut to that shot of ELP where they've got their names on top of the lorries. Okay, and punk comes along and it makes music all great again, and then we have the wonderful music that follows on, and all the fantastic pop music of the 1980s, like Madness and the Police and the Specials and all that sort of stuff. That story is utter rubbish. It's not true, and even me saying it, even me trying to describe it, you realise how stupid it sounds, and I'm having to go, oh yeah, well we won't worry about that, we'll miss that out, Let's not mention the fact that a lot of the progressive rock bands from the 1970s went on to become some of the biggest bands in the 1980s. Let's not mention that. Right, so I don't believe it's true. I don't think punk rock was the big anathema to progressive rock. I don't think it's its polar opposite at all. I'm going to argue that punk was actually the logical next step for prog, and that punk had prog in its DNA, and that most of the music that then emerged after it had prog in its DNA. That prog was actually such a fertile and important style of music that it went on to influence all music. So then when we look at all music after that, when we go and listen to all the pop music and rock music, prog is so deeply embedded in it that we can't see it. And so we write off all those progressive rock bands and we don't give them their due. All right, that is what my opinion is about prog. So where do we start with this? Well, let's go back to the 1960s. Let's go back to the Beatles. Right, the Beatles were a rock and roll band. Right, they had grown up listening to Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and that's what they were trying to emulate. They'd come out of the skiffle boom, and the skiffle boom was the 1950s punk. This was a style of music that enabled musicians to access creative music making with little to no skills. John Lennon had a skiffle band called the Quarrymen, and Paul McCartney, went to some fete or something, and they met up there, and the rest is history. They're a rock and roll band, but they're not just a rock and roll band. They were an English rock and roll band. And as an English rock and roll band, they had other influences. They had other influences from music hall. They had influences from, 1940s comedy acts, like the Laughing Policeman and George Formby, stuff like that. They've got that influence as well. And they've also got the rich classical music heritage that exists in England. They've also got the English sense of humour. there's an English sense of humour which of course is very famous and has gone around over the whole world, but famously people in other countries don't quite get. It's a quirky, putting yourself down, self-deprecating type of humour. You know, British people, English people, we don't attack things by saying that is terrible. We attack authority, we attack, privilege by pricking the bubble of it. The Laughing Policeman that I mentioned, these sort of musical songs and records that the Beatles would have grown up listening to, that puts in your mind not the average idea of a policeman. He's a jolly, happy fellow who just can't stop laughing. And in that way, it pricks the bubble of authority. Monty Python did this, the Carry On films did this. All English humour does it. Dad's Army does it, right? But also that's linked into a very literate aesthetic. We have the great writers, and we have Shakespeare, and we have Dickens, but we also have like nonsense writers like Edward Lear. We have Alice in Wonderland. There's all these things in the English culture that are just dripping with the Beatles. The reason I mention this is because once the Beatles get going, once they've had their hit records, almost straight away, all those influences that I mentioned start to creep in. I call this the English aesthetic. All right? It's in all of rock music. It's the special factor. If you take like the blues and country and western, Elvis Presley, and then bring into it this sort of English aesthetic, right? It creates a style of music that's gone around the whole world. People I know in America, they go, they'll say to me, what's in the water there? Where I live in England, just up the road, we have ELO, we have Led Zeppelin, we have Judas Priest, we have the Moody Blues, we have Duran Duran, we have UB40, all within 20 miles of where I live here in England. This is something that's it's Britain's biggest export. Is rock music. And the thing that makes rock music, not just prog, but the thing that makes rock music is these English aesthetic influences in it. So, and one of the things about Britain, I think, is that we've always been a very open country. We are a nation of immigrants. We have been taken over so many times by other cultures and had to assimilate those cultures. We always have done. And so I think the idea that in England and Britain, but I say England because it's often in London where these things happen, the assimilation of the blues and rhythm and blues into rock and roll in the 60s really created rock music. And this is another video that I've got to do. But just take it from me, it's not just the Beatles, but, Graham Bond and Brian Auger that ends up being like, Cream, and the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds. They're taking the blues, but this isn't Afro-Americans playing the blues. This is white, middle-class, usually art college educated musicians playing the blues and bringing in English aesthetic. Anyone who's listened to the first Cream album will know it's the blues, but it's got something else in there, and it's an English literacy. Is that the right way of describing it? The Beatles are the best example of this. They start pulling all those influences, classical music, sort of Edward Lear nonsense of, bits of the Goons, bits of Music Hall, bits of George Formby, and they start to expand, and they expand in such an incredible way. Now, I think one of the problems you have if you are a British musician working in the 1960s is you start to say to yourself, how can I honestly really stand up there and sing about a levee breaking when I am a middle class white British musician? How can I do that? And I think towards the end of the 60s that question was asked by a lot of bands. How do you take on the English aesthetic? How do you make rock and roll where you're not singing about stuff that isn't relevant to you? In England, this is solved in a lot of ways. If you look at a band like Chaz and Dave, who are prog, but I think they've got a huge chunk of prog in there, because what Chaz and Dave did, was they took basically like Jerry Lee Lewis, but they subsumed it into English culture and English themes, and they created this sort of what we think of sort of like Cockney, you know, comedy songs, but actually they're rock and roll songs. You know, so many bands did this, but I think there was a group of bands which starts with King Crimson and Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd, and then Yes, and then Genesis, that basically start to create rock and roll which is honest in its cultural background. It really takes on the English aesthetic. So for me, progressive rock and the English aesthetic are wound together. Okay, and I think all the great progressive rock bands have that in abundance. What's interesting is all the great British music acts have that to some extent. You know, Led Zeppelin has it, the Police have it, all these sort of the Specials of the Beat and Madness had it, even the Spice Girls had it. And if you think at Stormzy on Glastonbury with his Union Jack bullet vest, even he has it. This is the English aesthetic at work. It's a very powerful thing because the English aesthetic is so wonderful, and there's so many people who love it all over the world. I've realised this, that people love Britishness and especially Englishness, and it's travelled all over the world. And I think that's the thing that has to be mentioned with these prog bands. So what is this? What is the English aesthetic with the prog bands? It's a sort of, we're not going to necessarily sing about, you know, rock and roll themes. We're not going to sing about, you know, driving around in cars and, you know, boys trying to chat girls up, and, you know, we're not going to sing about that anymore. We're going to expand the themes, and we're going to go into sort of, you know, mythical themes, and we're going to go into sort of historical themes. Okay, we're going to use influences not only from rock and blues, but from jazz, but most importantly from classical music, and we're going to use the way that classical music extends and arranges music. We're going to bring that in as well. We're going to have a sort of English homemadeness about prog. All the great prog have this slightly homemade aspect to it. Okay. If you think of Peter Gabriel with his sort of costumes and these little plays he's acting out, you're allowed to do that in progressive rock, and you bring in these theatrical elements into it. Okay, this makes progressive rock really, really compelling. And the albums, even though you're dealing with albums with 20-minute tracks, you know, about sort of Eastern mysticism, they still sell millions and millions. Okay, and each progressive rock band, I think, also needs to be mentioned that the idea of the individual in Britain, we really value the individual, and we sort of champion them, especially the English eccentric, because we know the English eccentric is often at the bottom of his garden inventing the next thing. It's all about creativity and invention. So we value that sort of eccentric individuality. So what you hear is that in progressive rock as well. You see characters, and these characters are often on the fringes of society. If you think of Ian Anderson and his sort of Aqualung character, they're on the fringes of society often. They're on the edge, they're outsiders looking in. And every single progressive rock band does it in their own way. It's not a genre like heavy metal. You know, most heavy metal bands, it's hard to tell one from the other. But yes, are completely different to Genesis. Genesis are completely different to King Crimson. King Crimson are completely different to Van der Graaf Generator. That style, that progressive rock style, then exports across to the whole world. In Europe, you get either copies of progressive rock bands, or you get forms of music which are completely unlike progressive rock, which I would put the bands like Magma and Can. That's a completely different style of music, really, that gets lumped in with progressive rock. In America, I don't think they really know how to do it. Yeah, Kansas do some stuff, Rush do, but for every, you know, American progressive rock band we can mention, I'll be able to mention 5 classic British progressive rock bands. So I really believe that progressive rock is fundamentally a British form of music. It's an English form of music. I really do think that. And I think that anyone who's playing progressive rock will be listening primarily to British bands. So these bands, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they start to, dominate the scene. And then punk comes out. Now, punk seems like the complete opposite to prog, but I don't think it is. I think what's happened is another generation's come in. And they're challenging what prog's doing, without a doubt. But I don't see it as an anathema to prog. I tell you what style of music is the opposite to prog. It's disco. Disco's the opposite to prog. And disco's off doing its own thing. It doesn't even care about prog. It's not even on prog's radar. Okay? But punk's not like that. Punk is also dripping with the English aesthetic. It's also dripping with this idea of the individual and what the individual stands for. It's not going to sing about love and pop music themes. It's going to be on the outside. I really see that punk, the way it returns to rock and roll, is it returns to rock and roll simplicity, but it takes the blues out of it. Punk solves a problem in a way. Punk shows how you can play like a blues riff bass form, but without having the blues there. They lose that. Bands like The Clash, bands like The Damned, bands like The Stranglers, and bands like the Sex Pistols, I think it's arguable that in their DNA is prog. What they've done is they've turned around and snookered prog. They've gone, you think you're very clever, don't you? But you're not. And they brought them down a peg or two. As soon as punk happens, as soon as it's done that, it's arguable that they then all get very proggy. Punk itself only lasts for a few years, right? And then new forms of music come in, like new wave, electro, new romanticism, all really influenced by punk, right? But when you look at those styles, what's crept back in all those styles? What's actually happened? And what you see is they start to then expand it. They become more conceptual. They start to extend. So how could I explain this and argue it? Well, let's take the Sex Pistols, for example. After the Sex Pistols, John Lydon forms Public Image Limited. Public Image Limited is slightly more exploratory. But by 1986, they're making an album called Album, the Bill Laswell produced album. And this is a highly conceptual, expanded piece of music. There's quite long tracks on there with long guitar solos. There's a host of musicians coming in, some of them from the progressive rock world. John Lydon is expanding the form, because we know that John Lydon secretly was a Phonograph Generator fan. We can see that John Lydon's sort of character in the Sex Pistols is actually influenced by that Ian Anderson character from Jethro Tull. We can see all these little things that have passed on. Of course, a band like the Stranglers make progressive rock tracks in odd time signatures. The Damned dressing up all that horror thing and the whole thing, that is coming straight out of progressive rock. But what's interesting for me is after punk is the way the music starts to creep back in. And I can see an influence on sort of like Joy Division. I can see an influence there on the New Romantics. I mean, the New Romantics, how can you think that there's not a prog influence there? A lot of the switched on prog musicians, they spot this and they wind themselves in. The ones that don't wind themselves in, like ELP, they just die. But yes, it takes them a while, but they wind themselves in. They're very lucky that they had Trevor Horn on the Drama album and Jeff Downes, but Trevor Horn then goes on to produce a lot of the pop music, and that pop music in the early 80s, like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, is epic in the same way as prog's epic. A lot of the bands that come in afterwards are influenced by prog, you know, and so yes, are then able to pull their style in, and then they become one of the biggest acts in the world. Genesis do it too. Peter Gabriel does it too. Bands like The Police, which are just full of progressive rock musicians, carry on doing what prog's doing, but they wind it in. They just pull it down to pop song format. They still do all the things that prog do, but they wind it in, and they suddenly start having hit records. So my argument is that after punk, because punk has prog in its DNA, after the sort of overblownness of prog has been pulled in, a lot of the techniques that prog had developed, this idea of the English aesthetic, the idea of cocking, pulling down authority and questioning authority, the idea that it's like sort of homemade, the experimentation with technology and electronics, the sort of conceptual ideas that you had in prog. When you start to pull that down, what you see in especially British pop music is punk plus prog. I can't go into it. All seems like that to me. Vienna by Ultravox. That's a prog epic that's been pulled down, and it does everything that a prog band used to do, but in a sort of really short format. Why? Because those musicians had grown up listening to prog. Prog's all over pop music in the 1980s, but it's not just there that the influence has happened. If you take like heavy rock, you take like your Led Zeppelins and your Deep Purples, when punk comes along, you see bands like Judas Priest and UFO. They look at punk and go, well, that's sort of more heavier than us. We need to heavy it up. Motorhead do the same thing. So you get the beginnings of heavy metal as punk sort of. They go, well, it'd be better to pull this all in and get it a bit more visceral and aggressive. And then the new wave of British heavy metal comes in, which really is influenced by punk. But what happens is that those early new wave of British heavy metal bands, I think especially like say Iron Maiden and especially Diamond Head, those bands are dripping with prog. And so that gets wound into early heavy metal. When bands like Metallica come along, they are basically very heavy progressive rock bands producing epic tracks with all the imagery and all the stuff that used to go with prog. So heavy metal is dripping with prog influence. 1980s pop music is dripping with prog influence. But we also see the prog influence coming through in even in say like Parliament Funkadelic. I think George Clinton had an eye towards prog in the early 70s, and that sort of conceptual science fiction thing that he brings in, so that the influence that goes into hip hop is very proggy. I would argue that Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly album, which is a sort of conceptual album that uses like jazz musicians and all sorts of different instrumentalists to expand on the sort of hip hop rap form, it's arguable that is a progressive rock album. I've argued that the Streets Debuts album, which is highly conceptual, is a progressive rock album. Of course, the classic prog audience won't accept this. They don't see this as being prog, and they argue the case. This is not prog. This is not prog, and it is fair point, because I think the prog influence, those things I've discussed, they really are in so much music. I think when then we had the big rave explosion in the late 80s, early 90s, the prog influences wound in even more. And I see the sort of, in England again especially, in Britain again especially, the sort of New Age Traveller rave culture was very, very proggy. And it actually, people like Steve Hillage and Gong and all those, they actually were able to come back and relaunch their career because of what was going on in that culture. So as you could see, if my argument's correct, these things that prog pioneered in the early 70s were so huge and so influential that it influenced almost all music after that. So if you're a modern musician and you want to make an album that has a concept that runs through it, or you don't want to use a normal pop song form of, you know, verse, chorus, or you're really interested in using electronics and experimentation in a certain way, or you don't want to write songs about love and the usual sort of pop song ideas, you know, or you want to bring in sort of quirky humour or costumes or dressing up or, you know, strange stage shows and light shows, all that stuff was pioneered by progressive rock bands. So I think it's a real shame, and there's two shames here that I think we need to point out. One is that the standard music history story isn't correct and needs to be retold. And those bands that were ostracised. Now, why were they ostracised? I'll tell you why they were ostracised. Because the people who made progressive rock were cleverer than the critics that wrote the articles in the magazines. And they never liked that. Music critics always like to point to something that they think has come from the streets, you know, so they can explain why it's so great, because the artists can't. That is this patronising thing you get with music critics. I've discovered something that's so wonderful. It might seem really basic and down to earth to you, but it's not, and I'm going to tell you why. You know, but when they're dealing with prog, they have to understand composition and arrangement. They've got to understand literary illusions that may be beyond them. They've got to understand the conceptual ideas. They've got to understand the history of rock and roll relating to the history of other forms of music. And they've got to understand like jazz and classical and free jazz and experimentation. And they can't. They don't know that stuff, so they don't like it. All right? And that's a shame. And what's happened is certain bands do not get mentioned in the same breath that the Beatles get mentioned in, or the Rolling Stones. You know, certain bands have been of the critics have put on a pedestal, and yet utter geniuses that came out of progressive rock bands are sort of at the moment not valued in that way, and in some cases certain musicians are wallowing in obscurity. All the musicians, all the people who work in the industry know them and respect them. You know, I used to play for a progressive rock band called Frost, and Frost was run by a guy called Jem Godfrey, and Jem had already had a ton of success writing great big hit records. He wrote a number of number ones, and he'd come from the pop world. And that really exposed two things. One of them is this idea that Jem, it's so weird that someone who writes pop songs would be listening to progressive rock. Of course he would, because all musicians listen to progressive rock. If you're a musician, you learn your craft, you're going to listen to progressive rock. You either are going to listen to it and react against it, and you get that whole anti-prog thing, or you're going to go, no, I love it. And so often it's the case that musicians who you wouldn't expect to love prog absolutely love it, right? And this is a shame, because these bands like Yes and early Genesis, Gentle Giant, King Crimson to some extent, don't get valued in the same way as we value Lou Reed or the Ramones or the Beatles, you know, or Iggy Pop, all these things that the critics absolutely love. And I love all those artists as well, you know, but it's a shame that those bands have been ostracised. But more importantly, because the prog audience don't understand the lineage of it, they can't see and argue for the wonderful thing that is the thing that makes progressive rock so important. And the idea is that it's progressive. That basic idea that I haven't mentioned until right at the end of this video. What makes progressive rock? It's progressive. Any element that is trying to push the music forward, any element that's questioning the status quo, and not the band, but the situation that you find yourself in, any band that does that has its roots to some extent in terms of rock music in progressive rock. If you look at the way that progressive rock musicians did that, you will see that that's the way you do that nowadays. And so what happens is, in the world of progressive rock, the fans have become very narrow-minded. So basically they are looking for artists that sound like artists that they've decided are progressive rock. In other words, sound like the bands that they grew up and they've decided are progressive rock. And so it's very difficult for modern progressive rock bands to progress. So the progression happens elsewhere. And that's a shame. So how does this manifest itself in reality? Well, if you're a progressive rock band, what the old progressive rock bands did was that they mess with genre. This is one of the things they did. So they would take in different genres and they would mix those genres together. So if a new genre came out, progressive rock was really great at just taking that on board. This is what progressive rock did in the late 70s, where the artists that just took punk. So think what Peter Gabriel does when he leaves Genesis, all right? You think what Robert Fripp does in the early 80s. You think what actually Genesis themselves do. When they hear punk, they adapt and they pull themselves in. And in Peter Gabriel's case, he starts to take on the sensibility that's there in punk and new wave. Robert Fripp does the same thing. And in doing that, he creates a new form of music. He advances as an artist himself. And so when you listen to So with Sledgehammer and all that, he's taking on all sorts of influences that are apparent, at that time, not just punk and new wave, but also hip hop, and all that sort of stuff. I remember reading an interview with Phil Collins where he was just discussing the song Mama, and that vocal is influenced by, I think, Close to the Edge, which is not the rap, not the prog Close to the Edge, the rap Close to the Edge. And he's emulating vocals that he has heard from rap and hip hop in that song. And in doing that, it's moving the music forward. And it's a shame that the prog audience don't understand this aspect of progressive rock, and so they shut it down, they won't accept it. Me as a prog musician, I find this very difficult and limiting, in that I'm listening to all sorts of different music, including modern music, and you only have to put a whiff in that and the modern prog audience goes, oh, I don't like it now. Really don't like it. You can be prog. I understand that if you push it so far, it stops being prog. But I think if you're very clear on the things I've listed today in this video as being the attributes of prog, if those things are there, then it's pretty safe to say it's prog. Instrumental virtuosity, sort of odd time signatures, all that sort of stuff, and sort of clever arrangements, tricky, musical parts, virtuosity. I think that's one thing that has to be there. But also this English aesthetic, a sense of humour, sort of English literary allusions, a sort of homemade aspect. What else would you there? Sort of European classical arrangement, extended ideas, lyrics that aren't about pop music subject matter. I think when you've got that, if all of that's in there, then it's progressive rock. The only problem is that if you go and check out, like Kendrick Lamar, To Pimp a Butterfly, and put it on, right? Perhaps maybe it hasn't got that English aesthetic so much, but apart from that, everything else I said is there. So is that a progressive rock album? So this has been my little rant about progressive rock. I hope it's been interesting. It's just the start of a discussion. I'm really going to get into this now. I'm really going to get into this and explore it further, but I hope this has been interesting up until now. And I will hopefully see you soon on the next video. So if you like it, like it. If you want to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.